Okay, so let's start discussing this. And there's one factual thing I need to correct in the reading. Okay. When you guys do the reading, do you ever formulate questions, either writing them down or in your brain? On occasion. What would precipitate you doing that? What would cause you to do so?
Well, something that I thought was true, and then the reading said it's not, and it's like, oh, that's, I don't know.
Okay, so if there's new information that seems to be contradictory to what you've already known, and you're like, huh, why is that? Okay. Anybody else? So, and it's hard for me to ask the question, I guess, but how is it that you go about doing this? As you're reading a paragraph or reading a sentence, how do you determine whether it's important or not? Like, what's the process you guys go through? This is called metacognition, by the way, thinking about how we think. So what is the process you go through? Yeah.
There's like a date maybe, warrant.
Okay, so you're just going back to the whole history thing. If there's a date or a name, I write it down. Okay. How's that working out for you? Okay. Okay, Alan.
Because it has like a really big effect on like what we're learning about, like the topic.
Okay. And how do you try to determine or analyze if it does have a big effect?
Like it could cause other events to happen, or if it didn't happen, it could have changed the outcome of
Okay.
other things.
Okay. So let's look at the first paragraph, and just, I'll walk you through it, or we'll walk together. It says, during the American Revolution, the Americans drafted the Articles of Confederation to set up a new government independent of Britain. The article served as the Constitution of the United States until 1789, when a new Constitution was adopted. Sean, what notes did you take from that? Where are your notes? You do notes?
Yeah, I did.
So why aren't they out? Because you're supposed to be doing your notes for the last 15 minutes. So what information did you put in your notes from that paragraph? Christine?
The article served as the Constitution of the United States until 1789.
Okay. Interesting. Anybody else have something else that they wrote down or highlighted? Yeah.
The purpose was for the new government independent.
Good. All right. And I don't even know if you have to go all that in depth. The first thing we want to know is that we're establishing a new government. Okay. Now, why is this significant? Why is it important for us to know that they're establishing a new government? What questions should be going around in our mind about this idea that they're establishing a new government? Great. Okay. Possibly the why. Yes.
What kind of government?
Okay. I'm going to put type, I guess. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Who's doing it?
Okay, maybe the who. Which will affect that.
How do you decide
Okay. I'll put process then, I guess, is what we'll put up here. Alright. Now the why is probably the easiest answer, right? Unless you haven't been paying attention in class for the last 2.5 weeks. Why are they establishing a new government? Why are they establishing a new government? Yes, Scott? Good, right? They declared independence, so therefore, they have to set up a new government. How do we know they have to set up a new government? Because in the Declaration of Independence, what does it say? If any government becomes abusive or tyrannical, what do we have the right to do? Either alter or abolish it and create a new one, replace it. Okay? So, when we talk about the type, what should already be running through your mind? What types of government have we studied, and what types of government do you think that they'll pretty much throw out the window based on what you know? Are there any types of government that you could, at least at the beginning, think, well, they're not going to do that? Yes. You would tend to think monarchy, right? You would think that we're going to not go monarchy, but as you guys read, we know that's not necessarily true, right? Some people didn't dislike monarchy, they disliked the monarch, right? They didn't like King George III because he was British. They didn't necessarily dislike monarchy in general, okay? So there's one of those things. In fact, it seemed like more people were afraid of monarchy than what? As you read that, what did it seem like they weren't a huge fan of? What type of government? Huh? No, that's an economic system. What kind of government did they seem big fans of? Democracy, all right? Now, why wouldn't they be in big fans of democracy? And this goes back to the who. Who is setting up this government? Is it all the new people in the Republic, former colonists? No. It's a small group of men. And what do we say about this small group of men? They tend to be what? White and wealthy, right? So why might a wealthy guy not be a huge fan of democracy? Yes.
Doesn't want the, like, I'm not sure how to describe it, the people that are not as wealthy as the overpowered and rich.
Good, right? It's just based on numbers. There's more poor people than rich people, always. Okay, you're always going to have a bigger lower class than upper class. Well, if I'm in the upper class and I establish a true democracy, what am I basically doing? I'm giving the power to the people who are not me. Okay? So, we might think, well, obviously they're going to do democracy, because that's what we have today. And they just got rid of a monarchy, so they must want to get rid of the monarchy, but that's not always the case, right? So we have to be careful when we just jump to assumptions here, okay? By the way, what other types of government did we talk about? So we have a monarchy, we have democracy. What else did we have? Going back to our friend Aristotle. Okay, could do the polity, right, which is sort of a republic, which we'll get to. Oligarchy, aristocracy, right? So there's that mixture there. These guys would probably be an aristocracy, all right? They'd more likely be an aristocracy, all right? So what's the process? What's the process that they have to go through in order to form this new government? Well, we have two major types of states, because we can call them states now, right, because we declare independence. And Nicole, this is sort of where you were going with your question. What is the inherent conflict amongst the states? What problems do we have amongst the states? How can we divide up the states? How can we label them? Yeah. Okay. So we go population. What else can we use to sort of look at the states? Land, size. Okay. Just overall size. And there's probably at least one more thing we want to talk about, and that's economics, right? How are they making their cash? So Nicole, you were going to ask a question about population or representation. I think you were focused more on the people itself as opposed to the states. But let's look at the states, okay? If I'm joining this new club, because that's what we're establishing, this new government, how is the power going to be distributed? Remember, we always want to talk about power, right? And what did we say about power? We said it was finite. So if I'm losing it, that means what? Somebody's gaining it, okay? So why did the wealthy guys not necessarily big fans of democracy? Because they'd be losing the power, and who'd be gaining it? Those guys who aren't as wealthy as they are, okay? So how are we going to distribute the power? What kind of states have the power? Okay, big, large populations, okay? What else? Large size. What else? Strong economy. Okay. Now let's talk about economy. If we break it down into two different areas, what are two basic underlying factors in the economies? How is the South making their money? It's based on what? Agriculture. Whereas the North, to a large degree, is what? Manufacturing and trade, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to come into conflict, because once I harvest my crops, what do I need to do? I need to ship them out and trade them, right? So they sort of have some kind of a symbiotic relationship. But the economy is very, very different. Are the laws I want to pass if my economy is based on agriculture going to be the same laws that I want to pass if my economy is based on manufacturing and trade? And the answer is probably not. Okay? Probably not. Okay. How about size? When we talk about size, we're not talking about just the state, but also the land where, because that was mentioned in the reading as well. We're talking about land size, but where is part of this land? West of what? which is the Ohio Valley, which is that territory that we gained from what war? French and Indian War, right? Going back to the whole proclamation thing. Okay. And then the population, once again, what states have the largest population? There's going to be three of the most important. They are Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts. Okay. Now, what do you notice about those three states? One's from the south, one's from the middle, one's from the New England area, right? So they're going to have somewhat different kind of things. So how do we come up with, bless you, how are we going to come up with this new form of government? Have we seen before where these states, now states, former colonies, have ever worked together? Have there been any examples that they've worked together? And the answer is yes. And what were those examples? First one, 1765. What they do? What they form? Stamp Act Congress. Okay. Then we had the first Continental Congress, and eventually the second Continental Congress. And the first and second Continental Congress, how was power distributed? How was it shared? Everybody had what? This goes back to your point. Everybody had what? One vote, right? Each one of the 13 states had one vote, because equality seems to be the right thing to do. But we've had this question before. Does equal fair? Is it fair that each one of these states had one vote? Yes. So you're saying that it doesn't make sense because the population of certain states is just larger than other states. Okay. All right. Now, once again, if you remember way back to the Albany Plan for Common Defense, Ben Franklin said that your representation should be based on your income, right? How much money you're actually generating for the particular colonies. So we'll look at all of this as we go forward, all right? But why is it important? It's important because it tells us that the colonies have worked together before, but didn't work out perfectly, right? Didn't work out perfectly. All right. Skipping down to the fourth paragraph. It says, opposed independence because they saw a need for a strong central government, right? So even before we declared independence, not everybody was on board. But it says, without the authority of a parent state, wrote Joseph Galloway, many subjects of unsettled disputes must involve us in the horrors of a civil war. Well, how pathetic is that, right? Now, he's writing that back in 1775, and it's not until 1861 we have a civil war over certain issues like slavery. But I highlighted parent state. Did anybody have parent state in their notes? And if you didn't, that's fine. But what connection should we be making? What does that parent state sound like? This idea of him saying that we need to have a parent state. Without the authority of a parent state, many subjects of unsettled disputes must involve us in the horrors of a civil war. What does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Yeah?
Like, we don't have like a king kind of leader to help make decisions or manipulate others.
Okay, and who's that sound like? Who have we studied? Who have we analyzed? Who have we discussed that sounds real familiar to? See, this goes back to me just studying for the test and then forgetting it after the test, and me actually learning it, so now I can apply it back to this area. Who has Galloway obviously read? Hobbes. And what's the name of Hobbes' book? Leviathan. And what did he say the Leviathan was? An overawing power. Now, Mr. Hobbes called for what kind of government? Absolute monarchy. Okay? So once again, Galloway is thinking about that as well. He's saying, yeah, you know what, that Hobbes has a pretty good idea there. That if we don't have this overawing power, we're going to have this civil war. Okay. Now, not everybody agree with him, obviously, because we still declare independence, but there's that idea that we can't just get over this whole idea of, kings are bad. Okay? Second Continental Congress, all right? And now we're developing this central authority. So the question becomes, what kind of central authority do we want to have? Okay. Somebody give us a question. Somebody share one of their questions that they had. Yes.
So John Hanson was the first president, and who was George Washington?
Yeah, I saw that question that you wrote there. It's very interesting the way you phrased that. That goes back to one of those like Jeopardy questions: who's the first president of the United States? Or like George Washington, it's John Hanson. By the way, if you ever visit Princeton, the town of Princeton or Princeton University, there's that major hall there, and the name just escaped me, but that actually acted as the first White House. That's where John Hanson was for a while. Now, why do you ask a question about John Hanson?
Because it says in the reading that he's like first president.
Okay. So the question becomes, why is that significant? Or the question could be, is that significant? Is it significant to know John Hanson was the first president?
He's the first president, it's kind of a big thing.
Okay. Now, you're a sophomore in high school, so up until you read this, you assumed the first president was whom?
George Washington.
Okay. So now, has your whole world been altered? Is this like discovering, like, there's like no Santa Claus? Like, there's, wait, George Washington wasn't the first president? Stop the precedent. Okay. Yes, the whole been lying. John Hanson is the first technical president under the Arles Confederation, but not the first president under the Constitution. That's why the difference
They're
there.
still recognizing.
Right. So once again, I understand why you wrote it down, and I wouldn't not write it down. But in a big scheme of things, obviously, if you've gotten this far in your life not knowing who John Hanson is, there's a pretty good chance that it's not that significant. And to answer your question, who George Washington, he was in charge of the military at that point. So yeah, but it was just funny how you phrased that question.
Who the heck is George Washington?
Okay, who else has another question? Michael, give us a question you wrote.
Why did the Articles of Confederation fail?
Okay, I like that. We're going to hold off on that though, so it's a good question at the end.
Okay.
Or actually, no, it might be a good question at the beginning, so as you're going through your reading it. Okay, somebody else give us another question. Paige, give us a question you wrote.
What would have happened if we kept the Articles of Confederation as the U.S. Constitution?
Ooh. Okay. Okay. Counterfactual, what if? I like those. Michelle, give us one. Hold on, read that. Don't read the dates again. Just what were they like?
What acts were?
Oh, what were they similar to? Okay. By the way, 1784. I don't know why it says 1784. It should be 1785. Not a huge deal, but just immediate history kind of. Okay. Did anybody ask the question? What problems or issues did the new government face? Did anybody have any of those type of questions? James, you had that type of question. What was your? Read exactly what your question was, James. Okay. Well, that's an important question. I think that's a little bit different. Because you're saying that the Articles of Confederation are pros and cons. My question's more broad-based, right? What issues did they face? Okay? It's like one of those things, you probably heard this, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. So what did we wish for? Independence. What did we get? Independence. Now what do we got to do? Ooh, now we got to govern, right? Same thing leaving your house, like, oh, I got rid of my dumb parents. Like, oh, now I got to pay my own bills, okay? So what issues did this new government, whatever it's going to be, face? What are the issues they have to deal with in terms of moving forward? And I would argue that they talk about three big ones in the reading. Cool. Okay, debt is definitely one of them, so maybe I'll put four. Debt is certainly one of them. Yeah? No? Representation, right? And that goes back to how are we going to decide who gets represented? Okay, so we have representation. Tied in with debt, we have what?
Money issue, we don't have the same currency, we got into a depression.
Okay, so economics slash what goes with debt?
Taxation.
Taxation, okay? And the last thing that we'll see actually ties into this as well is what? Yeah, land, okay? So representation, taxes, and land. Those are the three big issues that this new Congress, this new government has to face, okay? How are we going to be represented in the government? What powers is that government going to have vis-a-vis, if we want to use a fancy term, vis-a-vis taxation, okay? And what are we going to do with the territory we now have? Because as the reading tells us, there's 3 states included in the fair state of New Jersey that doesn't have any land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So like, whoa, this doesn't really kind of seem fair. We just assume now that we're all in the same club, that we take that land, it would be more communal land, okay? And then divide it up for new states and such. So we'll see what happens there, okay? How many people have representation, taxation, and boundaries in their notes? How many have it in their notes? Did anybody ask a question about those things? Like what issues did the new government face? Did anybody ask that question? So you had it in your notes, but you didn't ask this question, right? Always want to do that. Make sure you have the challenges. Okay. What was the most immediate reason why they needed to form this new government? While the war was going on. what do they need the government to be able to do? So we're going to talk about the Irish Confederation after we win independence in 1783, but what major issue during the war did they face? They did need to pass laws, but specifically, what did they need to do? Think. And you know what the answer is because you know the outcome of the American Revolution. Why were we able to win the American Revolution? Sort of, kind of, yes. But not more than unity, but in addition to unity. What happened? I'll give you a hint. Saratoga. Yes. Yes.
French.
Okay. The French helped us, right? So why do we need to form a new government? Because if we don't have a government, who's not going to take us seriously? Okay, in this case, French, but just foreign countries, right? So if we want to be a country, we sort of have to be an adult, okay? Once again, to use the analogy, when you guys get your first job, you sort of have to buy the new clothes so it looks like you know what you're doing. The same thing's happening here. We declared independence, but if we don't have a government, it's really hard to go ask other people to take us seriously if we can't get our stuff together as a country, right? So once again, foreign alliances, most specifically with France. Okay. James, I'm going to take your question and tweak it a little bit. You said, what are the pros and cons of the Irish Confederation? How can we tweak that a little bit to make it a bit more focused than pros and cons? I do like the dichotomy of comparing two things, but instead of pros and cons, what should we use?
Accomplishments and failures.
Ooh, okay, we can do accomplishments and failures. Not what I was thinking, but I like that one. I might like that better in my answer. I was going to do strengths and weaknesses. All right, sort of what's going on here with the Irish Confederation, and what areas do we have to sort of deal with? And obviously, we know there's a bunch of them. All right. Okay. We're going to talk about power quite a bit, and we're going to see that power is always going to be split, and it's going to be split in many different ways. In this case, the first big chunk of power we're going to split up. How are we going to split it up? Between what two entities? We have what kind of governments?
Central.
Okay. We have a central government and a, in this case, state government, right? So who's going to get the power, right? Who's going to get the power? Who's going to be more powerful? Is it going to be equally split? Are the states going to be stronger than the central government, or the central government going to be stronger than the states? And what we're going to see in both cases, eventually, although not under the Irish Confederation, is what happens to both the government on a state level and a federal level. What do we do with that power? We do what? We separate them. Why does that sound familiar to us? Huh? Montesquieu, right? The spirit of law is saying that you should separate the powers. So eventually we're going to have what three? Judicial, legislative, and executive. Okay. And this sort of goes back to the weaknesses and strengths, pros and cons, however we want to phrase it. Accomplishments and failures. What didn't the government have under the Irish Confederation? What didn't they have? Okay. They didn't have judicial, right? There was no central judicial. And even though we had our friend, Mr. Hanson, okay, as president, we didn't have an executive branch, right? On the central level. Now, each state obviously did. What's the executive branch on state level, by the way? Who's our president of the state, if you will? Who's the president of the state? The governor. Okay. So on the individual levels, each one of these guys had this, but on a central level, they did not. So if we're talking about the scale of power under the Irish Confederation, under the Articles, who had more power, the central government or the state governments? The states, right? Because once again, they didn't see themselves as fully united as a country. They saw themselves as independent and getting together because the enemy, my enemy, is my friend. Okay? And in this case, the enemy they had in common was whom? Great Britain. Right? And we're going to see that once the war is over, we realize that, okay, now we have sort of 13 independent states that somehow have to get together. Right? And some people make the analogy with Europe today, that there's a European Union, but it's not really a union and all these other things. Okay. Legislative branch. in case you just hit on it. One of the most important powers a legislative branch has is the power to do what? Tax. Did this legislative branch have the power to tax?
No.
The answer is no. Okay? So we can see that one of the most important things a legislative branch can do, this one can't. So we understand now that the early republic, the Articles of Confederation, were extremely what? Weak, right? Which goes back to, Michael, is it your question? Why were they replaced?
No, not that.
Why did they fail? All right, it's this idea of a very weak central government, all right, and a very weak legislature in that government. Okay, a couple more things before we're done. What else could the legislative branch not do? So they couldn't tax. What else could they do? And somebody mentioned it before. Yeah. Regulate trade. All right. They could regulate trade with Native Americans, which is, but not within the states. Okay. So if there's a dispute amongst the states, there was nobody to go to. Okay. What else could they do? Okay. No federal court. Right. Which goes back to if New Jersey and New York have a problem, they have nobody to turn to. What are the powers that government usually have? Somebody mentioned it before. Anyone else? Money, right? Making of the money. Each state's making their own money, and then the government starts making their own money, and you have all these different currencies floating around, and it's really hard to figure out whose money is worth what in terms of paying off debts. Okay? In terms of paying off debts. So in the final structure of the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. And we'll see how that works out. You guys have read it already, you know how it works out, but we'll talk about that. Are there any questions? Okay. Along with your reading and taking notes tonight, make sure you're asking questions, writing questions down. Either putting them right on your Google slide presentation or writing in your notes so that when you come in tomorrow, all right? We're going to ask a lot of questions. I want you to formally write down questions, not just sort of I thought about these kind of questions, okay? Put them somewhere either at the end of your notes or on your PowerPoint or the Google Slides presentation. So make sure you're asking the questions, write them down. By the way, you don't have to answer them. If you have a question that you want to ask because you didn't understand something, that's valid as well. So make sure that you're asking questions. All right, you guys can start logging on, shutting down.